Long before it became a legend, the Jeep was just an idea, a desperate dream born from the mud of war. The year was 1940. Europe was already burning. Nazi armor rolled across the continent like thunder, and America knew that sooner or later its turn would come. But on the ground, there was a problem, a simple, brutal problem. The army had men, it had weapons, but it didn't have a vehicle that could keep up with war. Motorcycles were fragile, trucks were too heavy, horses were finished. The army needed something new, small, fast, light, and unstoppable. They wanted a machine that could go anywhere, do anything, and survive everything. It had to climb hills, cross rivers, race over mud, and carry soldiers into hell and back out again. And it had to be built in 49 days. No one believed it was possible. Engineers laughed. Bureaucrats rolled their eyes. Even the Army's own officers doubted the idea. But somewhere in the quiet corners of American factories, a handful of engineers began to dream. They imagined a vehicle that was more than metal, a partner for the soldier, something that could carry him, protect him, and never quit, no matter what the world threw at it. It wouldn't be pretty, it wouldn't be comfortable, but it would be tough. Tough enough to drag a wounded man to safety. Tough enough to charge through the mud of Europe and the sands of Africa. It was a dream of freedom on four wheels, and that dream was about to come to life.
In the summer of 1940, the United States Army issued a challenge that sounded insane. They needed a new kind of vehicle, one that didn't exist anywhere on Earth. It had to be light, under 1,300 pounds. It had to carry 3 men and a machine gun. It had to climb steep hills, haul through mud, and move faster than any truck in the arsenal. And the Army wanted a prototype in just 49 days. 49 days to design, build, and deliver a machine that could change the face of modern warfare. Dozens of manufacturers received the request. Only a few even dared to try. Most said it was impossible, too fast, too dangerous, too expensive. But one small company, the American Bantam Car Company, a struggling automaker from Pennsylvania, said yes. Bantam had no money, no Army contracts, and barely a handful of engineers. But what they did have was something far more dangerous than resources: belief. Belief that they could outthink the giants. Belief that a handful of men with tools and grit could outbuild the entire industrial world. The Army's request wasn't just a test of engineering, it was a test of courage. And somewhere in a small, dim workshop, engineers began sketching lines on paper, knowing that every pencil stroke might decide the future of the war. A vehicle was about to be born, from desperation, from stubbornness, and from the raw, unbreakable will to do the impossible.
In a tiny workshop in Butler, Pennsylvania, the sound of clanging steel echoed through the night. A handful of men, exhausted, grease-covered, running on coffee and adrenaline, were trying to build a miracle. The American Bantam Car Company had accepted the Army's impossible challenge to design a combat-ready 4x4 vehicle in just 49 days. They had no time for committees, no luxury for mistakes, and no second chances. Every bolt, every line, every inch had to serve a purpose. No comfort, no luxury, just survival. Chief Engineer Carl Probst, a quiet genius who joined the project almost by accident, became the mind behind the miracle. He looked at the Army's specs, the impossible weight limit, the impossible deadline, and he didn't flinch. He sketched the frame in hours. He calculated the load, the torque, the slope. And when the sun rose, the outline of the world's first Jeep was already on paper. They stripped everything unnecessary. No doors, no roof, no frills, only strength and function. It had to be simple enough for any soldier to repair, strong enough to haul a machine gun, and light enough to lift out of mud by hand. The prototype was small, boxy, and ugly, but it was brilliant. Steel bones, a beating heart of raw horsepower, a soul built for war. As the deadline closed in, they worked without sleep. Rivets clanged, sparks flew. The workshop smelled of oil, sweat, and desperation. And then, at dawn on the 49th day, it stood there, a squat, square, stubborn little beast. They called it the Bantam reconnaissance car. No one knew it yet, but this machine, this humble, hurried invention, would change the face of every battlefield to come.
The men at Bantam had done the unthinkable. In just 49 days, they had built the Army's miracle machine, a four-wheeled warrior born from pure willpower. But their work wasn't over. Now came the test, and the gamble that could make or destroy them. On a humid September morning in 1940, the Bantam reconnaissance car rumbled onto a flatbed and set off to Camp Holabird, Maryland, where Army officials waited to see if this strange little box on wheels could live up to the legend it promised. Every mile it traveled was a risk. If the truck broke down, if one gear failed, or one axle cracked, Bantam would be finished. They didn't have spare parts. They didn't even have spare engineers. This was a small company punching far above its weight. A handful of men trying to outbuild the industrial giants of Ford and Willys. But when the Army saw it roll off the truck, something changed. The little car looked like nothing else. Compact, sharp, almost defiant. And when they fired up the engine, the sound wasn't weak or timid. It growled. It tore across fields, bounded over ditches, and climbed hills that left soldiers staring in disbelief. It forded streams, hauled guns, and never stopped. The trial drivers pushed it harder, faster, rougher. They tried to break it, but the Bantam refused to quit. At the end of the trials, one officer simply said, "This is it." The Army had found its warhorse. But there was a problem, a cruel twist that Bantam never saw coming. They had built the legend, but they might not be the ones who got to keep it.
Bantam had done it. They'd built the impossible machine, a vehicle so tough, so agile, so perfect for war that the Army couldn't look away. But in Washington, wars aren't fought on battlefields. They're fought in boardrooms. And in those rooms, Bantam was far too small to win. The Army loved the Jeep, but they didn't trust one tiny company to build thousands of them for a global war. So behind closed doors, they handed Bantam's blueprints to two industrial giants, Ford Motor Company and Willys Overland. The race was on. Ford had the power, the production lines, and a factory army of engineers. Willys had experience with rugged engines and a bold claim that their design would be stronger, cheaper, and faster to build. Bantam, the pioneer, suddenly found itself outnumbered, outspent, and nearly erased from its own creation. But competition breeds perfection. Each company built its version of the Jeep: the Ford GP, the Bantam BRC, and the Willys MB. The Army tested them all, in mud, snow, and blistering heat. Engines roared, axles cracked, dust clouds rose like battle smoke. One by one, the weak fell away, and one machine stood out: the Willys MB, rugged, powerful, and endlessly reliable. It could climb steeper hills, carry heavier loads, and still come back for more. When the decision came down, the verdict was clear. Willys would build the Jeep. Ford would help produce it. Bantam would fade into history. But the spirit of that first little company, the dreamers who dared to try, lived on in every bolt and every roar of the engine. The Jeep now belonged to the world, and soon it would have to prove itself on the hardest proving ground of all: war.
The war machine of democracy needed legs, and those legs would come on 4 wheels. When the Army chose Willys Overland to mass-produce the new light reconnaissance car, it wasn't just awarding a contract, it was forging a weapon of mobility. The engineers at Willys took everything Bantam had started, everything Ford had refined, and pushed it to the absolute limit. The result was the Willys MB, a box of steel but a heart of fire. Under its hood roared the Go Devil engine, a 60-horse-powered beast that laughed at mud, snow, and sand. It could pull, climb, swim, or crawl its way through anything. It was ugly, square, no chrome, no comfort, no luxury. But that was its genius. Every inch was built for purpose: flat fenders for sitting or writing maps, a folding windshield for shooting over, a hood you could eat lunch on or perform surgery on in the field. This wasn't just a vehicle, it was a soldier's tool, a battlefield companion. You could start it in the freezing cold, tow an artillery gun, lay telephone wire from it, or mount a machine gun on top and turn it into a tiny tank. And if it broke, any soldier with a wrench and a prayer could fix it in minutes. The Willys MB wasn't built in luxury labs or designed for elegance. It was built in sweat, in oil, in urgency. It was the people's vehicle of war. And soon it would roll off assembly lines by the tens of thousands, headed for deserts, jungles, and beaches that would define the next 5 years of human history. The Willys MB had been born. Now it was time to send it into battle.
By 1941, the world was on fire. Empires clashed across continents, and freedom itself hung by a thread. Armies needed tanks, planes, and ships, but what they needed most was mobility. They needed a vehicle that could do what no other machine could: go anywhere, carry anything, survive everything. The Willys MB became that machine. It was light enough to lift by hand, strong enough to tow artillery, and reliable enough to start every morning, even after being battered by war. The Jeep, as soldiers now called it, was more than steel and rubber. It was a promise of movement. On every front, it became a symbol of life itself. In the deserts of North Africa, it carved trails across endless dunes, outpacing tanks and trucks that sank in the sand.
In the jungles of Burma, it crawled through mud and monsoons, delivering medicine, food, and hope where no road dared exist. In the snows of Europe, it hauled wounded men out of the fire and carried generals into the storm. Every army it touched adopted it. British commandos, Soviet scouts, Free French resistance. They all called it the same thing, a miracle on wheels. General Eisenhower himself would one day say, "The Jeep, the Dakota, and the landing craft were the three tools that won the war." The world needed a hero that didn't wear a uniform, a soldier made of metal, not flesh. And the Willys MB answered the call. It didn't complain, it didn't rest, it just kept moving forward. Through dust, fire, and blood, it carried not just men, but the weight of freedom itself.
Before the Jeep could conquer the world, it had to prove itself in war. The year was 1942, and the first production Willys MBs were being shipped to training camps and battlefields from America to North Africa. The Army's question was simple: could this tiny, unarmored, open-top machine survive the chaos of real combat? The answer came quickly. At dusty proving grounds, soldiers pushed the Jeep to its breaking point, and it refused to break. They drove it over logs, through rivers, up slopes that trucks couldn't climb. They jumped it off dunes, flipped it, dragged it, repaired it, and drove it again. It could ford streams 4 feet deep, haul 1,000 pounds of gear, and hit 60 miles per hour on open ground. When mud filled its tires, soldiers simply lifted it out by hand. When the battery died, they could start it with a hand crank or a single push from a friend. This was no ordinary vehicle. It was a toolbox on wheels, ready to become whatever the mission demanded. Gun carrier, field ambulance, wire layer, command post, escape vehicle. The Jeep was the Swiss Army knife of war. In North Africa, General George S. Patton's men drove it straight into the desert, where even camels struggled to survive. Under scorching heat and enemy fire, the Jeep didn't falter. Its engine roared like defiance itself. The soldiers laughed, not at it, but with it. They painted names on its hoods, tied their helmets to its bumpers, and treated it like one of their own. Because by now, it was. The Jeep had been tested by fire and passed. It wasn't just a machine anymore. It was a brother, a lifeline, a legend in the making.
Across the ocean, in the heart of Nazi Germany, the new American toy car had become a joke. When the first reports of the Willys Jeep reached Berlin, German engineers laughed. A car without doors, without armor, open to the wind and bullets? They scoffed. They called it a peasant's tractor, a machine unfit for the battlefield. The Reich believed in power through perfection, precision tanks, massive engines, machines built like fortresses of steel. To them, the Jeep was an insult, a crude box on wheels made for farmers, not soldiers. But while German officers mocked from behind their panzers, the Jeep was already rewriting the rules of mobility. In the deserts of Libya, it darted between Rommel's armored columns, slipping through dunes and ravines where no German vehicle could follow. In the hills of Tunisia, it became the eyes of the Allies, scouts, raiders, and saboteurs, appearing where no army was supposed to be. It carried messages, guns, wounded men, and it never stopped. German troops began to whisper about it, that little American car that seemed to appear out of nowhere. It could vanish into the night, then roar out of the dust like a ghost. Soon, laughter turned into curiosity. German engineers began studying captured Jeeps, taking them apart piece by piece. They couldn't believe how simple it was, how it worked with so little, how it kept running even when broken. Where the Germans built machines of pride, the Americans had built one of purpose. And in war, purpose beats pride every time. The Jeep had entered the enemy's imagination, and that was the beginning of fear.
By 1943, the Jeep had become a soldier's shadow. Wherever they went, it followed. From the frozen forests of Norway to the burning deserts of North Africa, from the swamps of Burma to the rubble of Italy, the Jeep was always there. It didn't care about the terrain, the weather, or the odds. It crossed rivers too deep for trucks, slid through mud that swallowed tanks, and tore through sandstorms that blinded men and machines alike. It climbed mountains with no roads, carried the wounded through enemy fire, and delivered ammo where even mules refused to go. When the rain poured, it turned into a raft. When the snow fell, soldiers chained skis to its wheels. When the engine broke, they fixed it with wire and willpower. There was no manual for survival. The Jeep was the manual. In the deserts of Alamein, it ran alongside British armored divisions, its wheels kicking up the same dust as Churchill's tanks. In the jungles of Burma, it roared beside the Chindits, hauling wounded men out of ambushes and diving into mud so deep it drowned rifles. And in the mountains of Italy, it became a climbing beast, its tires clawing through stone and snow, pulling supply lines where trucks could never reach. Everywhere it went, the Jeep became part of the soldier's story. They gave it names. They painted teeth, stars, and slogans on its hood. Some even said it had a personality, brave, stubborn, and loyal. And when a Jeep was hit, men felt it like a friend lost. Across mud, blood, and sand, it carried freedom on its back. It was more than a machine now. It was a symbol of endurance, of defiance, of hope that kept rolling forward even when the world seemed ready to stop. The desert, the true test of any machine and the graveyard of those that failed. In 1942, the North African front was a furnace. Temperatures soared past 120 degrees, sand filled every engine, and entire convoys disappeared beneath the dunes. The tanks overheated, the trucks broke down, the men suffered. But one vehicle thrived, the Jeep. Light, simple, unstoppable. It cut across the Sahara like it belonged there. While the great machines of war struggled, the Jeep laughed at the desert's cruelty. It carried fuel, ammo, and hope through landscapes where compasses spun aimlessly. It hauled wounded men across burning sand and chased the sun over endless horizons. British commandos of the Long-Range Desert Group stripped their Jeeps down, mounted heavy machine guns, and turned them into desert raiders, phantoms of the dunes. They attacked German convoys at night, disappearing before the dust even settled. Rommel's troops never knew where they came from or where they went. American units followed, using Jeeps to scout enemy positions, to navigate minefields, and to strike deep behind enemy lines. Every bolt of the Jeep was coated in grit. Its paint burned under the sun. Its tires tore across sharp rock. But it never quit. When engines overheated, soldiers poured water or even coffee into the radiator. When tires shredded, they wrapped them in rope and kept driving. No vehicle had ever endured such punishment and asked for more. In the desert, the Jeep became a creature of survival, part man, part machine, built not for comfort, but for victory. And as the dust settled after each skirmish, you could see one thing clearly: a small, square silhouette rolling on through the heat haze, unbroken, Unbothered, unforgettable. The desert had tested the Jeep, and the Jeep had won.
By the time the dust of North Africa began to settle, the Jeep had already earned a place beside the greatest commanders of the war. To the generals, it was more than transportation. It was freedom on wheels. From Eisenhower to Patton, from Montgomery to MacArthur, every great Allied leader had a Jeep at their side. It carried orders across battlefields, hauled maps, radios, and men who decided the fate of nations. It rumbled through war councils and front lines alike, a humble witness to history in motion. General George S. Patton called it one of the greatest tools ever given to an army. He didn't just ride it, he commanded from it. Standing tall in the passenger seat, goggles on, revolver at his hip, the Jeep became his mobile throne. Eisenhower used it to inspect divisions, to visit soldiers in the mud and snow, to stay close to the men who would carry freedom forward. He once said the Jeep was as vital as the soldier's rifle. Even General Montgomery, ever precise and composed, trusted his Jeep more than any staff car. It was reliable, quick, and could get him exactly where he needed to be, even under fire. And for the rank-and-file soldiers, seeing their commander arrive in a Jeep meant something powerful, that leadership wasn't watching from the rear, it was right there with them. The Jeep blurred the line between officer and soldier, rank and dirt, authority and camaraderie. It didn't care who sat in the seat, a private, a general, or a president. It carried them all the same. When Eisenhower and Patton drove through liberated towns, crowds cheered, not just for the men, but for the machine that had carried them to victory. The Jeep became a symbol of democracy itself. Simple, rugged, equal. It didn't shine. It didn't boast. It just kept going, right beside the men who led the free world.
The soldiers had a saying about the Jeep. It can go anywhere and do anything, and somehow it always did. No terrain could stop it. No obstacle could humble it. From the sands of Africa to the snow of the Ardennes, the Jeep moved like a living thing, obedient to no rule but willpower. It could swim through rivers, crawl up cliffs, and squeeze through spaces where even bicycles hesitated. If the road ended, the Jeep simply made its own. It pulled broken trucks, carried the wounded through minefields, and became a home for soldiers who had none. One moment it was hauling ammunition, the next it was a command post, then a makeshift ambulance, a mobile kitchen, a radio hub. There was no manual, no training, just trust. A bond between man and machine forged in dust and blood. Soldiers improvised everything. They bolted armor plates to the sides, mounted machine guns on the hood, and tied spare parts to every inch of metal. In Italy, it climbed the impossible. In the Pacific, it floated on bamboo rafts. In France, it drove straight through chaos and celebration. Everywhere it went, it carried something intangible, the spirit of movement, because war, more than anything, is about getting there first. The Jeep didn't need roads. It didn't need comfort. It just needed purpose. And wherever that purpose called, the Jeep went. In a world drowning in complexity, this little machine taught a simple truth. Sometimes, the key to victory isn't size or speed or firepower. It's the will to go anywhere, do anything, and never stop.
Every army has its heroes, but few are made of steel and bolts. To the men who fixed them, the Jeep wasn't just a machine. It was a companion, a partner that never quit, even when it was held together by wire and hope. The Jeep was built to be fixed anywhere. Its parts were simple, interchangeable, and designed by men who knew that a mechanic in a foxhole couldn't afford perfection, only function. A broken axle? Use a branch. A flat tire? Wrap it in rope. A shattered windshield? Who needs one anyway? The Jeep forgave abuse. It tolerated mistakes, and it kept moving long after logic said it shouldn't. Soldiers joked that if you had a hammer, a wrench, and a prayer, you could keep a Jeep running forever. Mechanics loved it for another reason too. It taught them resilience. Every repair was a battle. Every patch job a small victory over chaos. They rebuilt engines under artillery fire, changed transmissions in the rain, and scavenged parts from wrecks just to keep one more Jeep alive. In the field, they gave each one a name: Betsy, Lucky, Hellhound, Daisy. Machines turned into friends. Metal turned into memory. Because when your life depended on 4 wheels and a heartbeat of steel, you didn't see a vehicle, you saw survival. And so the Jeep earned another title: the mechanic's best friend. It didn't need pampering. It didn't need perfection. It just needed belief and a man with dirty hands who refused to let it die.
While soldiers fought across oceans, another army was waging its own quiet war. An army of workers, armed not with rifles, but with wrenches, fire, and grit. From the assembly lines of Toledo, Detroit, and Dearborn, the heartbeat of industry thundered day and night. Men and women worked side by side, forging freedom in steel and sweat. Every Jeep that rolled off the line was more than a vehicle, it was a promise. A promise that no soldier would be left stranded, that the fight would reach every battlefield, no matter how far, no matter how hard. They built them by the thousands, simple, strong, identical, each one stamped with a serial number, a symbol of unity in a world divided by war. Crates marked Willys MB and Ford GPW stacked high in warehouses, awaiting their next journey. By train, by ship, by courage. Loaded onto freighters, they crossed the Atlantic under the threat of U-boats. Salt air corroded their paint, but not their purpose. When those crates were opened on foreign soil, in England, in Africa, in the Pacific, the scent of oil and home filled the air. Within minutes, soldiers could unbolt, unfold, and assemble a Jeep in the field, like building a piece of America from the ground up. The factories didn't just build machines, they built morale. Each Jeep carried with it the invisible fingerprints of thousands of hands, hands that believed in victory long before it was certain. From the clanging of factory hammers to the roar of engines on the front, the Jeep's journey was the story of a nation in motion, a nation that refused to stand still until freedom rolled across the world.
War has a way of breaking everything: men, machines, even hope itself. But the Jeep was different. It wasn't built for comfort. It wasn't built for glory. It was built to endure. Soldiers told stories of Jeeps that should have been dead. Engines full of sand, axles snapped in half, tires shredded to nothing. And yet, somehow, they kept going. One Jeep in Italy took a direct hit from mortar fire, its windshield blown to glass dust, hood twisted like paper. But the driver turned the key and it roared back to life. Another in Burma ran for days without oil or brakes, its driver steering with one hand and faith with the other. Mechanics welded frames with scrap metal, replaced gears with parts from wrecked tanks, and still, the Jeeps rolled on. In the Ardennes, through snow and ice, they started when trucks froze solid. In the desert, they ran when engines melted from the heat. The soldiers began to believe that maybe the Jeep had a soul, a stubborn, steel-hearted soul that refused to die before its mission was done. They painted bullet holes, patched the seats with canvas, and named them like brothers. Each Jeep told a story of near misses, of laughter in the mud, of survival against all odds. Because the Jeep didn't just carry soldiers, it carried faith. And when the war ended, many of those Jeeps were still running, still starting on the first turn, still waiting for one more road. The world had built thousands of them, but the truth is, you could never kill just one, because the Jeep that wouldn't die wasn't just metal. It was the will of everyone who refused to surrender.
Italy was supposed to be beautiful, and it was. But in 1943, beauty was buried beneath mud, smoke, and blood. The Apennine Mountains stood like walls between the Allies and victory. Steep, rocky, treacherous. No tanks could climb them. No trucks could pass. Even mules gave up. But the Jeep did not. It clawed its way up slopes that seemed impossible, its engines straining, its tires spinning against wet stone and loose earth. Soldiers held their breath as the little vehicle inched along ledges barely wider than its wheels, a single slip away from death. When the roads disappeared, the Jeep became the road. It carried ammunition, food, and stretchers, hauling the lifeblood of the front where no machine had ever dared to go. Through rain and sleet, through minefields and mortar fire, it never turned back. Drivers learned to trust it like a living thing. They felt every vibration, knew every rattle, and listened to the soft growl of its engine as if it were whispering, "Keep going." One soldier later said, "The Jeep could climb a mountain just to prove you're wrong." It pulled artillery up goat paths. It brought the wounded down through hell. And when bridges collapsed, it crossed rivers on planks and prayers. The German forces called the terrain impassable. The Jeep called it Tuesday. By the time the Allies reached Rome, those little machines had done the work of giants. They had turned the mountains of Italy into stepping stones toward freedom. And as the sun rose over the battered hills, you could still hear them, the distant rumble of engines, climbing higher, pushing forward, refusing to stop.
June 6, 1944. D-Day. The beaches of Normandy exploded with fire, metal, and chaos. And rolling through that chaos, half buried in surf and smoke, were the Jeeps. They came ashore in landing craft, packed tight beside men, rifles, and dreams of liberation. Engines covered in salt water, tires sinking into sand that swallowed boots whole. The first waves hit the beaches under machine gun fire. Some Jeeps sank before their tires ever touched France. Others burst from the ramps, charging through waves and wreckage, bullets hissing all around. To the soldiers who survived that landing, the sight of a Jeep climbing out of the sea was like a miracle on four wheels. They became lifelines, hauling wounded men to safety, dragging supplies from stranded boats, carrying commanders through burning towns. Every road was gone, every bridge destroyed, so the Jeeps made their own. They darted between craters and barbed wire, through minefields and shattered bunkers, always forward, always fearless. The Germans couldn't believe how quickly the Americans moved inland. They expected tanks. They got Jeeps.
Dozens, hundreds, thousands, each one bouncing through the mud, spitting sand, pulling freedom behind it. The beaches that morning were filled with screams, smoke, and courage. But somewhere in all that chaos, 1,000 tiny engines began to roar. That was the sound of momentum. That was the sound of liberation on wheels. From the surf of Normandy to the streets of Paris, the Jeep would lead the way. Small, scarred, unstoppable. It had come across an ocean to drive the first miles of Europe's freedom. And it did, one tire mark at a time.
By 1944, the war had changed. The sky itself had become a weapon. Day and night, waves of Allied bombers darkened the heavens above Europe. And below them, on roads and runways, the Jeep was always there. While B-17s and Lancasters thundered overhead, the little Jeep became the nervous system of the air war. It carried pilots to their planes, hauled bombs to the wings, and dragged wreckage off the fields so the next squadron could take off. When the bombs began to fall, it became the first to move, racing through smoking ruins, delivering medics, messages, and sometimes miracles. In shattered French towns where roads were gone and rubble was deep, the Jeep drove anyway, under sirens, under falling walls, under skies that glowed red. It was fast, silent, and small enough to slip through chaos where trucks would die. Soldiers said it felt alive, like it knew when to stop, when to speed up, when to duck under flying debris. In the ruins of Caen, in the ash of Dresden, in the broken airfields of Belgium, it kept rolling through a Europe that was burning from above. It became the link between the earth and the sky, the humble servant of both ground troops and pilots. And when the dust settled after each bombing run, it was the Jeep that brought the living out and sometimes carried the fallen home. Men began to say, if the sky belongs to the bombers, then the ground belongs to the Jeep. Because when the sky fell on Europe and the world seemed to collapse in fire and thunder, it was the Jeep, still crawling through smoke and ruin, that refused to stop moving.
December 1944, the Ardennes forest. Silent, frozen, deadly. Snow covered everything. Tanks froze solid. Engines cracked in the cold. Men shivered in foxholes, cut off, surrounded, outnumbered by the German counterattack. This was the Battle of the Bulge. And in that brutal winter, the Jeep became a lifeline. It started when nothing else would. While trucks groaned and tanks refused to move, the Jeep turned over, a soft growl in the cold silence, and rolled forward into the white abyss. Soldiers wrapped blankets around the engines to keep them warm. They used gasoline-soaked rags to thaw the oil. And still, the Jeeps kept moving. Through knee-deep snow, over ice-slick roads, through fog so thick you couldn't see the man beside you. They carried food, ammunition, and the wounded who couldn't walk. They drove at night, headlights blacked out, guided only by memory and instinct. Many drivers froze their hands to the wheel. Some never came back. But those who did told stories of how their Jeeps pulled entire columns of men out of encirclement, how they rescued pilots, hauled anti-tank guns, and never once gave up. The enemy tried to break the Allied line, but what they couldn't see in the snowstorms was that the Allies had a secret weapon, a simple, stubborn, unstoppable machine. When even the mighty tanks lay silent,
It was the Jeep that kept the front alive. It crawled through snowdrifts, crossed icy rivers, and delivered hope wrapped in khaki and steel. In that frozen hell, the Jeep wasn't just a vehicle, it was momentum made of metal. And when spring finally came and the snow began to melt, they found the tire tracks still there, proof that even in the darkest winter, the Jeep never froze and freedom never stopped.
War has a way of turning everything into something new. And no machine proved that more than the Jeep. It began as a scout car, a nimble runner between the lines. But soon, soldiers discovered something remarkable. The Jeep could become anything they needed it to be. With a wrench, a torch, and imagination, it transformed. Need an ambulance? Stretchers on the hood, blankets in the back, and it became a lifeline for the wounded, racing through artillery fire, carrying blood and hope. Need a weapons platform? Bolt a 30 or 50 caliber on the rear, and suddenly it was a mobile gunship. Soldiers called them buzzsaws on wheels. Need a radio command post? Mount the set, raise the antenna, and it became the voice of the battlefield, transmitting orders through chaos. Flamethrower jeeps, rocket launcher jeeps, even armored ones made from scrap plates and sandbags, each one unique, each one deadly. In the Pacific, Marines strapped machine guns to the sides and roared through jungles like thunder on vines. In Europe, commandos used them for lightning raids behind enemy lines. The Jeep could fight, heal, scout, and lead. It was never built for war, but it became war itself. And yet, even as it gained weapons and scars, it never lost its heart. No matter what the battlefield demanded, the Jeep adapted, quietly, efficiently, endlessly. That's what made it different. That's what made it immortal. While tanks dominated headlines and planes ruled the skies, the Jeep did everything in between. The jobs no one remembered, the miracles no one wrote about. It was the machine that could not be defined, because every time you tried, a soldier somewhere had already turned it into something else. From ambulance to assault vehicle, it carried both destruction and salvation, sometimes at the very same time. And in that contradiction, it became a symbol of what war really is. Not glory, not machines, but men, finding a way to make anything survive.
By 1945, the war was ending. Cities lay in ruins, flags rose again over shattered skylines, and in the dust of victory, one humble shape kept appearing: the Jeep. It rolled through liberated villages, covered in mud, bullet holes, and smiles. Children climbed onto its fenders, soldiers waved from its seats, and everywhere it went, people cheered. To them, it wasn't just a machine, it was freedom, made visible. The same Jeep that had thundered through deserts, that had clawed over mountains and beaches, was now driving through streets lined with flowers. Parisians painted flags on its hood. Villagers offered wine and bread. In Italy, people touched it as if it were sacred, because it was the first sign that tyranny was over. For millions across Europe and Asia, the sound of its little four-cylinder engine meant the war was ending and life was beginning again. It didn't matter who was driving, an American, a Brit, a Free French, or a resistance fighter who had stolen one from retreating Nazis. The Jeep became the same thing everywhere: hope
on 4 wheels. It was simple, humble, and human, just like the freedom it represented. Newspapers called it the mechanical symbol of liberty, and Eisenhower himself said, "The Jeep, the Dakota, and the landing craft. These were the 3 tools that won the war." From the white cliffs of Dover to the rubble of Berlin, the Jeep became the face of liberation, a reminder that even in the darkest times, strength can come from simplicity. When the flags waved and the cheers filled the air, the tanks stood silent, the planes were grounded. But the Jeeps, they kept rolling, carrying soldiers home and freedom forward. Because long after the fighting stopped, the world would remember the little machine that crossed oceans and empires to remind humanity what it meant to be free.
Even legends fall into enemy hands. The Jeep, with all its brilliance and simplicity, was no secret to the Germans. They saw it in the mud, in the ruins, and on the front lines, and they wanted it. Captured Jeeps became prized trophies of the Reich. When German soldiers found one abandoned or overturned, they didn't destroy it, they repaired it. They studied its engine, measured its frame, and drove it straight back into battle, this time wearing iron crosses instead of stars. It was the perfect machine, even for those it was built to defeat. The Wehrmacht painted them in camouflage, added German plates and field radios, and used them to sneak through Allied lines. Some even carried SS officers who trusted the Jeep's speed more than their own vehicles. The irony was sharp, a symbol of freedom now driven by those who sought to crush it. But the Jeep didn't care about politics. It didn't choose sides. It served whoever turned the key. And that's what made it dangerous and brilliant. German engineers took it apart, hoping to understand its magic. What they found wasn't advanced technology, it was elegance in simplicity. No fancy systems, no complex design, just purpose. So inspired were they that the Axis powers built their own versions, the Kubelwagen and Schwimmwagen, but none ever matched the heart of the original. Even when captured, the Jeep refused to die. It infiltrated the enemy, turned their logistics against them, and rolled through occupied Europe like a ghost of resistance. And sometimes, fate played its joke. Those captured Jeeps were later recaptured by the very men who built them. A cycle of steel and survival. The machine that couldn't be stopped, not by distance, not by war, and not even by the enemy's hands. Because you can capture a vehicle, but you can't capture its spirit.
In the beginning, they laughed. To many German engineers, the American Jeep looked crude, too small, too simple, too primitive. Where was the precision? Where were the fine-tuned systems? It was nothing like their complex machines of war. But as the years dragged on and the Allies advanced across Europe, that laughter began to fade. Because wherever the Jeep went, victory followed. It crossed rivers the Germans said were impassable. It climbed slopes their vehicles couldn't touch. It ran on fuel so poor it would have crippled their engines. And it kept going, always going. So when captured Jeeps arrived at German workshops, the same men who once dismissed them now gathered around like students before a master. They took it apart bolt by bolt, examined every weld, every curve of the steel frame, and what they found shocked them. It wasn't brilliance, it was clarity. No unnecessary pieces, no wasted weight, everything built with one purpose: to survive. They discovered that the Jeep's secret wasn't power or complexity, it was understanding. Understanding what war demanded: reliability, adaptability, and speed. It could be repaired by a farmer, driven by a rookie, and built by the thousands without flaw. The Germans had engineered masterpieces, but the Americans had engineered efficiency. One German officer reportedly said, "Give me an army of these cars, and I could have gone anywhere." After the war, those same engineers studied the Jeep's design in factories and universities across Europe. Its blueprints became the foundation for post-war engineering philosophy, machines that were simple, functional, and human. The Jeep had done the impossible. It turned mockery into respect, and respect into imitation. The same minds that once sneered at its simplicity now built upon it. Because the truth was undeniable. Sometimes genius isn't in what you add, it's in what you leave out.
March 1945. The heart of Germany lay just beyond the Rhine River, a barrier as old as Europe itself. For centuries, armies had reached its banks and stopped. But this time, the Allies wouldn't stop. And leading the charge across that legendary water wasn't a tank. It was the Jeep. Under artillery fire and clouds of smoke, they rolled toward the river, mud-spattered, bullet-scarred, engines roaring. Pontoon bridges shook beneath their weight. Some Jeeps were ferried across on rafts. Others plunged straight into shallow crossings, water rising to their hoods, engines choking, wheels clawing for grip. Drivers kept their hands steady, eyes fixed on the opposite bank, a land that had once seemed untouchable. And then, one by one, they made it. Across the Rhine, into the heart of Nazi Germany. Behind them came tanks, trucks, and artillery. But it was the Jeep that first carried the stars and stripes onto enemy soil. It darted down broken roads, through shattered villages, past burning factories and fields of twisted steel. It carried scouts and medics, officers and couriers, each one part of the unstoppable tide that was now sweeping across the Third Reich. German prisoners looked at those little machines in disbelief. How could something so small, so simple, have made it this far? But by then, everyone knew you couldn't stop a Jeep. It had crossed deserts, mountains, oceans, and now the final river. And on that gray March morning, as Jeeps rumbled into the ruins of the Reich, one soldier wrote in his journal, "We followed the sound of those engines. They were the sound of the end." The Rhine had fallen. The road to Berlin was open. And the Jeep, once doubted and dismissed, had just rolled into history again. By the war's end, the Jeep had traveled farther, fought harder, and endured more punishment than almost any machine in history. It crossed 5 continents, from the deserts of North Africa to the frozen forests of the Ardennes, from Pacific jungles to the cobblestone streets of Berlin. Everywhere soldiers went, the Jeep went first. It climbed mountains where tanks failed, charged through rivers that swallowed trucks, and crawled over minefields and rubble as if it were alive. Engines sputtered, bodies were dented, tires shredded, but still they ran. There were stories of Jeeps dragged from bomb craters, repaired with nothing more than wire and luck, and rolling again within minutes. In the jungles of Burma, they were stripped for parts and reassembled miles away under enemy fire. In the snows of Bastogne, they carried the wounded when ambulances couldn't pass. On Pacific Islands, they became everything: taxis, tractors, and gun platforms.
Every dent told a story, every scar a survival. Some soldiers said the Jeep had a soul, others swore it had 9 lives. When the war finally ended, many were too battered to return home, left behind, rusting in the mud, silent witnesses to the cost of victory. And yet, some were repaired, repainted, and kept running. Farmers used them to plow fields where battles once raged. Villagers used them to rebuild what war had destroyed. They had gone through hell and come back still moving. A machine born from desperation, forged in chaos and proven in fire. No medals, no monuments, just the sound of an engine that refused to quit. The Jeep had done its duty, and then some. It didn't just survive the war, it outlived it.
The guns fell silent. Europe lay in ruins, and through the smoke and rubble rolled the symbol of victory, the Jeep. It wasn't polished or shining, its paint was scratched, its tires worn thin. But to every soldier who saw it, it wasn't just a machine, it was freedom on 4 wheels. When news of victory spread, Jeep convoys rolled through liberated cities, flags flying, crowds cheering. Children climbed onto hoods, soldiers waved from the seats, and people who had suffered for years finally smiled again. Everywhere it went, the Jeep carried something more than men. It carried hope. It became the photograph of liberation, the sound of peace returning. In Paris, London, Rome, people didn't see an army vehicle. They saw a promise that tyranny could be defeated, that freedom could move again. General Eisenhower himself would later say, "The Jeep, the Dakota, and the landing craft were the 3 tools that won the war." It had earned its place beside heroes. From D-Day to VE Day, from the deserts to the mountains, the Jeep was always there, leading the charge, hauling the wounded, pulling victory behind it. And when the Allies marched in triumph, Jeep engines echoed through city streets like a victory song. No parade was complete without them. No victory photo felt real until one appeared in frame. The war had made legends of many things: planes, ships, soldiers. But the Jeep was different. It was humble, stubborn, unstoppable. It was the spirit of victory itself, not flying above the battlefield, but driving through it. 4 wheels, 1 mission, and a legacy that would never fade.
May 1945. The guns have gone silent. The world exhales. And on roads once torn by fire and fear, the Jeep still rolls on. It had survived the impossible. It had carried men through the storms of war, across continents and chaos. But now, its greatest journey was just beginning. The war was over, but the legend was only starting. Soldiers who had driven them through hell couldn't forget the feeling. The rough engine hum, the open wind, the machine that never failed them. They wrote home about it, brought photos, and when peace came, they wanted one for themselves. And so, the Jeep, born from the ashes of war, became a peacetime dream. Factories that once built for battle, now built for freedom. Willys began producing the CJ, civilian Jeep. Same heart, same soul, but now painted for peace. Farmers used it to plow. Doctors used it to reach the sick. Explorers drove it where no car could go. It became the heartbeat of the New World, a machine that didn't know the word quit. Across America, people saw it not as a weapon, but as a symbol of toughness, of resilience, of the spirit that had won the war. Even in countries once occupied, Jeeps stayed behind. Locals rebuilt them, drove them, and remembered the day they'd arrived with the soldiers who brought freedom. From battlefields to backroads, from victory parades to quiet farms, the Jeep became part of history and part of humanity. It was no longer just a vehicle. It was a legend, one forged in fire and carried forward in peace. The war had ended, but every time a Jeep engine started, the story continued. Because legends don't stop when the fighting ends. They just find new roads.
The Jeep that once rumbled through smoke and gunfire now sat in driveways and barns. Its war was over, but its purpose had only changed shape. No longer draped in camouflage, it wore the dust of country roads. No longer carrying soldiers, it carried families, tools, and dreams. The same engine that had pulled wounded men from battlefields now hauled plows through American soil. The same frame that had endured artillery fire now bounced children on Sunday drives. The Willys CJ, the civilian Jeep, wasn't just a vehicle, it was a symbol of how the world was rebuilding. Farms that had sent sons to war now used Jeeps to bring in harvests. Towns that once rationed gasoline now saw Jeeps carrying supplies and hope. It became the machine of the people, simple, loyal, and unbreakable. Adventurers took it into the wilderness. Ranchers used it to herd cattle. Hunters, explorers, scientists all found that same wartime toughness ready to serve peace. Even in the suburbs, it became something else, a reminder of what endurance looked like, of what freedom felt like, of how something built for war could become an engine for life. The Jeep had crossed from battlefield to backyard, and in doing so, it carried the spirit of a generation with it. Men who once fought beside it now repaired it with their sons. Mothers who prayed for its return now drove it to the market. The world had changed, but the Jeep had adapted just as it always had. And as new roads stretched across new frontiers, one truth remained. Wherever there was work to be done, a trail to be broken, a place no one else could reach, the Jeep would find a way. It had conquered the world through war. Now it was helping to rebuild it, one backyard at a time.
The war had ended. Empires had fallen. The world stood shattered and ready to rebuild. Amid the ruins and the silence, one sound returned first, the low, steady hum of a Jeep engine. It rolled through broken cities, over bridges that no longer stood, carrying food, medicine, and hope. Where tanks once rumbled, Jeeps carried children to school. Where artillery had scarred the earth, Jeeps helped plant new crops. From the rubble of Europe to the jungles of Asia to the farmlands of America, the Jeep was there. The same machine that had carried freedom into war was now carrying the world into peace. It became the backbone of rebuilding, hauling bricks, pulling plows, delivering mail, building roads, and connecting people once divided by destruction. And soon its spirit spread everywhere. In Japan, engineers studied its simplicity. In Europe, factories rebuilt with its philosophy: strength through clarity, function over pride. Even decades later, every off-road vehicle, every SUV, Every 4x4 carries a spark of that same DNA, the machine that refused to quit. The Jeep didn't just survive history, it shaped it. It helped win a war, then helped rebuild the peace that followed. It carried soldiers, farmers, explorers, and dreamers. It crossed mountains, deserts, and oceans. And somehow, through all of it, it became something far greater than steel and rubber. It became a symbol of resilience, of movement, of freedom itself. From battlefield to backyard, from victory to recovery, the Jeep became the machine that helped build the modern world. And even now, when its engine growls to life, you can still hear an echo of soldiers shouting, of engines roaring, of history being made on four wheels. The Jeep didn't just conquer war, it conquered time. A legend born in battle that never stopped driving forward.